What did it mean to give birth in the Middle Ages? To answer that, we need to step into a world where medical science was fragile, religion was omnipresent, and childbirth was both a miracle and a battlefield between life and death. In medieval Europe, the understanding of the female body was shaped less by biology and more by theory and tradition. Physicians and scholars followed the teachings of Galen and Hippocrates, filtered through Christian theology. Women were thought to be colder, wetter, more prone to imbalance, and their wombs were seen almost as mysterious chambers governed by humors and divine will. Pregnancy was not well understood. Many believed that conception was the result of both male and female seed, while others argued over whether the fetus had a soul immediately or only after quickening, when the mother first felt movement inside her. For the woman herself, pregnancy was not simply a time of anticipation. It was a period shadowed by risk. Miscarriages were common, and the causes which we today know could include malnutrition, infections, or genetic complications, were attributed in medieval thought to divine punishment, demonic interference, or the mother's emotional state. To guard against misfortune, women relied on a mixture of faith and folk remedies. Amulets inscribed with prayers, relics of saints, and herbal concoctions, meant to ease discomfort or ward off evil spirits. Pregnancy was in many ways a spiritual as well as a physical journey. When labor began, it was almost always women who took control. The figure of the midwife was central. Usually experienced but not formally trained, midwives carried with them generations of inherited knowledge. They knew herbs for easing pain, oils for massaging, and prayers for protection. But they were not alone. Sisters, mothers, neighbors, and female kin gathered to form a circle of care. Men, including husbands and priests, were usually kept outside the birthing room. This was a female space, charged with secrecy and solidarity. The birth chamber itself became a ritualized environment. Windows were often shuttered, not just for warmth, but to keep away spirits believed to prey on women in labor. Candles were lit, both for light and for spiritual protection. Objects with symbolic or holy power were placed nearby, a rosary, a relic, or a cross. The woman in labor might grip a piece of cloth tied to the ceiling beam to help her push, or sit on a birthing stool designed to let gravity assist. In this dim and enclosed space, the boundary between the natural and the supernatural blurred. But despite all these measures, childbirth was dangerous, frighteningly so. For many women, it was the most perilous moment of their lives. Maternal mortality was high, with estimates suggesting that up to 1 in 10 women might die as a direct result of childbirth complications during their lifetime. Infections, obstructed labor, and hemorrhages were often fatal, since surgical solutions like cesarean sections were either unknown or only attempted as a last resort, usually when the mother had already died in an effort to save the child's soul. Infants too faced grim odds. Stillbirths were frequent, and those who survived their first year were considered fortunate. Because of these risks, childbirth carried profound religious meaning. Women were urged to confess their sins before labor, since many did not survive. If a child was in danger of being born dead, the midwife herself might perform an emergency baptism, a practice the Church both sanctioned and scrutinized. The theology of original sin made baptism urgent, for a soul unbaptized could not enter heaven. Thus, the moment of birth was also a moment of judgment, framed in eternal stakes. To give birth in the Middle Ages, then, was not just a biological act. It was an event woven from fear, faith, community, and the stark reality of mortality. It was an experience where women's hidden expertise flourished in a world that otherwise silenced them, but also where their lives were constantly at risk. It was a passage that embodied the medieval world, you itself, fragile flesh, bound by divine order, struggling between life and death, earth and eternity. So when we ask, what did it mean to give birth in the Middle Ages? The answer is layered. It meant stepping into the most dangerous threshold of a woman's life. It meant relying on faith and tradition more than medicine. It meant trusting other women whose wisdom carried more weight in the birthing room than the university-trained physician. And ultimately, it meant living within a culture where the arrival of new life was always shadowed by the possibility of death, and where both outcomes were understood as part of God's plan. Part 1. The medieval understanding of the female body. Hey everyone. Tonight we're drifting back into the Middle Ages. So if you haven't already, dim the lights, tuck yourself under the blanket, and let's quietly wander into the strange and not-so-romantic realities of childbirth in a world where medicine was more of a rumor than a science. Because tonight's story is about what it meant to give birth in the Middle Ages, which, to summarize, meant suffering, confusion, and a constant sense that God might be punishing you personally. But we'll take it slowly. No rush. Just let the centuries roll by in candlelight while you drift along. Now, the medieval understanding of the female body, it was, to put it generously, a little flawed. Modern anatomy textbooks were still many centuries away. Instead, people relied on what were called the humors, those 4 liquids inside you that were supposed to control everything from your digestion to your personality. Blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If you had too much of one, you might be melancholic or quick, tempered or constantly tired. And if you were a woman, well, the general consensus was that you had all the wrong humors, in all the wrong amounts, practically all the time. Women, they said, were cold and moist by nature, which sounds less like a medical observation and more like someone describing an unfortunate towel. This, however, was considered serious science. A woman's cold, damp body was believed to explain why she was weaker, why she was more emotional, and why, naturally, she was the one who had to do all the messy business of childbirth. And childbirth was framed not as a natural cycle, but as a dangerous eruption of those flawed humors. Doctors, usually men, and usually people who had never once been present at an actual birth, wrote confidently that the female body was prone to misfiring. The womb was often described as wandering. Yes, the wandering womb. If a woman fainted or complained of chest pains, or frankly did anything inconvenient, some learned authority was ready to declare that her womb had decided to float up into her lungs or slide dangerously near her throat. The cure, naturally, you were supposed to lure it back down again. With perfumes, with certain foods, or by simply telling the woman to get married and have children, which was assumed to be the only safe and proper use of her body anyway. Because if the womb was wandering, then only childbirth could anchor it back into place. So you can see where this is going. For medieval thinkers, childbirth wasn't just inevitable for women, it was practically medicinal. It was, in their world view, the only way to keep the female body from going completely haywire. And because of that, the female body was always framed as a problem in need of solving. Menstruation was treated as both a necessary cleansing and a kind of monthly toxicity leak. Too much of it, and she was sickly. Too little, and she was dangerously full of poisons. And pregnancy. That was the grand test. The point where all those humors and fluids were supposed to line up and do their job. If they didn't, well, clearly something sinful or supernatural had interfered. You'll notice how little room this left for real, physical explanations. Miscarriages weren't about infections or genetics or nutrition. They were often said to be punishments from God, the work of demons, or simply proof that the mother had been careless in her prayers. And naturally, everyone else had an opinion. Priests, neighbors, relatives, all quite sure of why a woman had lost her child and rarely interested in offering comfort. Still, in their own strange way, medieval people did try to help. Herbal remedies were popular, though they were often wildly inconsistent. One midwife might recommend a calming tea. Another might suggest you rub the belly with goose fat. Yet another might insist you carry a charm made of dried frog bones, not because it worked, but because, if nothing else, it gave you the faint reassurance that someone was doing something. Even the great universities, those shining centers of medieval learning, didn't exactly make progress here. Medical students memorized ancient Greek and Roman texts, added a dash of theology, and called it wisdom. Which is why the medical consensus could still insist that women were simply defective men. That was the phrase. Defective men. Men whose bodies had failed to generate enough heat in the womb to push outward and become properly male. If that sounds absurd, it is. But it was the kind of absurdity that had a very real impact on women's lives. Because if you believed that women were just cooler, damper, and overall less complete humans, then of course you believed they needed constant control. And if you believed childbirth was their one redeeming function, then naturally, every pregnancy was framed as a moral and spiritual duty. And this is where it gets darker, in a quiet, inevitable sort of way. Because once you place that much pressure on a single act, bringing a child into the world, you create an environment where failure or even complications become loaded with shame. A woman who died in childbirth was not just a victim of biology. She was a reminder of sin, of weakness, of divine judgment. A woman who survived might be praised, but never without the reminder that she had simply done her duty. And so the medieval understanding of the female body wasn't just bad science. It was an entire worldview, a framework that kept women confined and anxious and always preparing for the most dangerous trial they would ever face. Childbirth. Part 2. Pregnancy as a risky journey. Hey everyone. If you're still awake, and I wouldn't blame you if you weren't, we're moving now from the medieval idea of the female body into the long, uncertain months of pregnancy itself. A journey that, in the Middle Ages, was equal parts hope, fear, and bizarre superstition. Today, if someone tells you they're expecting, it's usually accompanied by some kind of plan. There are doctors, vitamins, endless lists of things to avoid, and the faint terror of baby, named debates. But in the Middle Ages, the plan was usually just survive, hopefully, maybe, and naturally, if things went wrong, there was always someone nearby to blame you for it. So let's picture a medieval woman, somewhere around the year 1200. Maybe she's the wife of a farmer, or perhaps she's married into nobility and lives in a chilly stone castle with more rats than furniture. Either way, her daily life is a cycle of labor, the agricultural kind, not the obstetric one. And then suddenly she realizes she hasn't had her monthly bleed. Now, missing a period could mean several things. It could mean pregnancy, of course, but it could also mean illness, or malnutrition, or simply that her humors were taking a day off. Medical clarity was not exactly abundant, which meant that women often had to rely on subtle signs: nausea, cravings, fatigue. All the usual suspects. If she started craving clay, dirt, or coal, people might nod knowingly and say, "Ah yes, she's with child." Pregnancy tests, as you might imagine, were not reliable. One popular method involved mixing a woman's urine with wine. If the mixture changed, she was pregnant. If it didn't, she wasn't. The results were, let's say, inconsistent. But then again, in a world where leeches were considered a valid health strategy, no one was expecting double, blind clinical trials. Once pregnancy was suspected, life shifted. For noblewomen, pregnancy was both a duty and a public matter. A noblewoman's job, at least according to her in-laws, was to produce heirs, preferably male, and preferably quickly. A barren wife was a liability, often sent back to her family in shame, or replaced by someone thought more fertile. For peasant women, there was less dynastic pressure, but the risks were the same. Carrying a child meant months of uncertainty. And here's where things get quietly grim, because pregnancy was risky at every stage. Miscarriages were frequent, often in the first few months. Premature births were just as dangerous, and the medical tools for dealing with them were essentially non-existent. Many women would lose multiple pregnancies across their lifetimes, and because the explanations for why this happened were based on sin, demons, or simple bad luck, there was no real comfort to be found. To protect themselves, women turned to a mixture of remedies. Charms and amulets were popular. A piece of parchment with a saint's name worn under the clothes. A little relic, maybe a splinter of wood said to be from the true cross, or more likely from someone's firewood pile, tied to a ribbon and hung around the neck. Herbal concoctions were common too, drinks made with fennel, rue, or sage. Some of these may have actually helped a little. Most didn't, but again, reassurance is powerful, and if you believed a potion would protect your unborn child, sometimes belief itself was half the treatment. And of course, there were rules, endless rules. Don't eat certain foods, don't lift heavy things, don't walk alone at night lest the fairies take an interest. In fact, supernatural explanations were always close at hand. A miscarriage might be blamed on witchcraft, or the evil eye, or even on the mother's own improper thoughts, which, of course, meant more guilt for her. For elite women, pregnancy was wrapped in ceremonial importance. Queens were often secluded during their pregnancies, surrounded by attendants, and subjected to rituals that blurred the line between medicine and theater. The health of the kingdom rested on their bodies, and yet their bodies were treated with deep suspicion. If a queen miscarried, whispers might begin at court. Was she cursed? Was she barren? Or had God simply judged the family unworthy? It wasn't just women who carried this anxiety. Husbands and fathers, despite being excluded from the actual birthing chamber, obsessed over pregnancy too. For dynasties, the continuation of bloodlines meant everything. Medieval Europe was practically built on the shaky foundation of, well, let's hope she gives birth to a boy this time. And when she didn't, when yet another fragile daughter was born, or another stillbirth occurred, frustration spilled out in some fairly cruel ways. Women were blamed, punished, or quietly replaced, because naturally, men concluded the problem couldn't possibly be theirs. And then there were cravings. These were taken very seriously. It was believed that if a pregnant woman craved something and didn't get it, the child might be born with a defect or a strange mark. A woman who longed for strawberries but was denied them might give birth to a child with a strawberry-shaped birthmark. The logic is questionable, but it does explain why so many families scrambled to meet even the strangest demands of expectant mothers. A craving for bread, manageable. A craving for roasted peacock with almond sauce in midwinter, considerably less convenient. Let's drift now into the rhythm of daily life during pregnancy. For noble women, pregnancy could bring a temporary reprieve from certain duties. Less time at feasts, fewer obligations in public ceremonies, but it also meant constant scrutiny. Her body became a matter of gossip. Servants whispered, courtiers speculated, priests prayed, and chroniclers eagerly jotted down predictions. If the pregnancy failed, it would not simply be a private loss. It would be written into the chronicles of the kingdom. For peasant women, pregnancy brought no such reprieve. Work had to continue, fields to tend, animals to feed, bread to bake. Many women worked up until the moment labor began. And then, as soon as they had recovered, assuming they did, they went back to it. There was no maternity leave, no protective laws, no system to ease their burden. Just the same grinding routine, made heavier by the weight of pregnancy. There was, however, some solidarity. Women leaned on one another. Experienced mothers advised younger ones, sharing remedies and stories. Midwives provided reassurance where physicians could not. And community rituals helped mark the months. Blessings, prayers, candles lit at church. Small gestures that wrapped pregnancy in a blanket of shared hope. But beneath it all, the risks loomed. Infant mortality was high. Maternal mortality was high. And everyone knew it. which meant pregnancy was never just a joyful anticipation. It was always a gamble, a roll of dice that could bring new life or sudden tragedy. We can picture, perhaps, a noble woman lying awake in her chamber, feeling the stirrings of life inside her. She prays quietly, clutching her rosary. She wonders if this time, finally, a son will be born. She remembers the infants she lost before, the funerals, the empty cradle. And she knows, in the back of her mind, that she herself might not survive the months ahead. And still she carries on. Because there is no choice. That was pregnancy in the Middle Ages. A risky journey, walked with courage, superstition, and very little actual medical understanding. A journey where every month was a test, every craving a superstition, and every prayer a lifeline. Part 3. The role of midwives and women's knowledge. Hey everyone. If your eyes are already heavy, that's fine. Let this next part just wash over you. We're still in the Middle Ages, still tracing what it meant to bring new life into the world. And tonight, we've reached the figures who made it possible, or at least tried to. The midwives. Now, midwives didn't exactly come with certificates or diplomas. There were no standardized exams, no professional boards, and certainly no neat little offices with framed degrees. Instead, knowledge was passed down from one woman to another. A midwife might have learned from her mother, or an older neighbor, or simply from long experience, often painful experience, because learning on the job in medieval obstetrics came with obvious risks. Despite this lack of formal training, midwives held a kind of quiet authority. They were the ones summoned when labor began. They were the ones who knew how to position the birthing stool, how to rub aching muscles, which herbs might soothe, and which prayers seemed to work best. In a society where physicians were nearly always men, and men were nearly always barred from the birthing chamber, midwives existed in a sphere of female expertise that slipped neatly outside the usual male-dominated structures of power, and of course, that made men very nervous, because the medieval world was not a fan of unsupervised women with specialized knowledge, which meant midwives were often both respected and distrusted. They were indispensable when childbirth went smoothly, but if things went wrong, and they often did, suspicions quickly surfaced. Was she negligent? Was she incompetent? Or, more ominously, was she secretly a witch? Yes, the medieval imagination loved that particular accusation. A successful midwife might be praised for her skill, but she might also be eyed suspiciously. How did she know so much about herbs? How did she calm the mother so effectively? How did she seem to bring babies safely into the world when others could not? Clearly, she must have made some sort of deal with the devil, because naturally, human experience and observation were not acceptable explanations. Yet, despite these suspicions, communities relied on them, because the alternatives were bleak. Physicians were expensive, rare, and more likely to prescribe bloodletting than anything genuinely helpful. Clergy could offer prayers, but prayers did not stop hemorrhages, and fathers, brothers, or husbands had little to no role inside the birthing room, which meant midwives stood as the central figures in childbirth, supported by a circle of other women, mothers, sisters, friends. This female-centered network made childbirth unique in medieval society. In almost every other sphere of life, men presided. In law, in politics, in property, in education, men decided. But in the birth chamber, for a brief, intense period, men were shut out. Women managed everything. They controlled the atmosphere, the rituals, the physical process itself. And they did so with a blend of tradition, improvisation, and the occasional quiet joke about how little the men outside actually understood. Let's pause here for a moment and imagine the scene. A small, dimly lit chamber. The shutters are closed against drafts and spirits alike. Candles burn steadily, casting flickering shadows on the walls. A woman labors, gripping a wooden beam or the arm of a birthing stool. Around her, midwives and attendants murmur encouragement, sprinkle in prayers, and offer her sips of broth or spiced wine. The atmosphere is tense but intimate. Outside the door, men pace uselessly, listening for cries of a newborn or for silence. The tools available were simple: a birthing stool with a hole in the middle to allow gravity to help, cloths and towels for the mess, oils for massage, herbs for pain relief, though relief here is a generous term. Opium and strong alcohol were known in some places, but hardly common, and more often than not, women were expected to endure labor with minimal comfort. What midwives did have, though, was technique. They knew how to shift the mother's position, how to ease the baby's passage, and in rare cases, how to perform what we might call crude obstetric interventions. Turning a breech baby, for example, was not impossible. Dangerous, yes, but midwives sometimes attempted it. These techniques were rarely written down, since literacy was low and men dominated written medicine. Instead, they lived in the hands and memories of women, passed on in whispers and demonstrations, preserved in practice rather than parchment. This is why midwives occupy such a strange place in history. On the one hand, they were essential, skilled, and respected within their communities. On the other hand, the lack of written records means their contributions are often invisible to us now. What we do know tends to come through the lens of men, physicians, clerics, or later, witch hunters who alternately admired, feared, or condemned them. And yet, if we look closely, we can see their outlines. We see them in the legal records, where communities defended trusted midwives against accusations. We see them in baptismal accounts, where midwives were authorized to baptize infants in emergencies. That, by the way, was an enormous responsibility. If a child was in danger of being born dead, the midwife herself might perform a quick baptism, sprinkling water and invoking the name of the Trinity, because an unbaptized soul was believed to be doomed, so in her hands rested not just a life but an eternal destiny. No pressure. We also see them in the way they were paid. Payment varied wildly, sometimes coin, sometimes food, sometimes clothing. For poorer families, midwives might simply be repaid with a warm meal or a favor returned later. For noble households, the payments could be more generous, though, of course, even well-paid midwives often found themselves in precarious positions. If a noblewoman died in childbirth, the midwife was an easy target for blame. Better to accuse her than admit that even wealth and status couldn't conquer the brutal odds of medieval labor. And those odds were brutal. Maternal mortality rates were high, infant mortality even higher. A midwife could do everything right, follow every ritual, pray every prayer, and still lose both mother and child, which made her simultaneously respected and feared. She was necessary, but she was never fully trusted. It's worth noting that this suspicion only deepened in later centuries, especially during the witch-hunting craze of the early modern period. Midwives, with their herbal knowledge and their intimate role in women's lives, were prime targets. But even in the Middle Ages, centuries before the worst of that frenzy, the seeds were already there. The idea that a woman with too much knowledge, too much independence, and too much power over life and death was somehow unnatural. And yet, despite all this, midwives carried on. They served their communities, guided countless women through childbirth, and preserved a body of practical knowledge that male physicians often ignored, but later borrowed freely, sometimes passing it off as their own discoveries. Because naturally, the best way to preserve your authority as a male doctor was to quietly copy what midwives had been doing for centuries, and then pretend you'd invented it. But for the women in labor, none of that mattered. What mattered was that when the pain began and the fear set in, someone was there. Someone who knew the rhythms of childbirth, someone who could offer a steady hand, a murmured prayer, a bowl of herbs, and the reassurance that she was not alone. That was the role of midwives, the keepers of women's knowledge, guardians of an experience men preferred not to see, but could never fully control. Their legacy is faint on the page, but strong in the survival of countless mothers and children. Part 4. The dangers of childbirth. Hey everyone. If you're still awake, congratulations. And if you've already started drifting off, even better. Tonight we're moving slowly into one of the darker realities of the medieval world, the dangers of childbirth. Now, childbirth is never exactly a risk-free experience in any time period, but in the Middle Ages it carried a particularly grim reputation. People didn't talk about it as a natural joy so much as a gamble where the house usually won. Statistically, the odds were harsh. Depending on the region and the century, a woman faced something like a 1 in 10 chance of dying from childbirth over the course of her life. Which might not sound too bad until you remember that women gave birth repeatedly, over and over again. 10 or more pregnancies was not unusual, so the odds stacked up quickly. Eventually, it was less about if tragedy might strike, and more about when. And medieval people knew this. They didn't live under the illusion that childbirth was safe. It was understood, quite plainly, that every time a woman went into labor, she was walking a tightrope over an open pit. No wonder prayers, charms, and relics were called upon so insistently. It wasn't just ritual for comfort, it was desperation dressed as faith. The causes of danger were many, hemorrhage for one. Losing too much blood after birth was common, and without transfusions or proper interventions, it was often fatal. Then there were infections, what we'd now call puerperal fever. A simple lack of hygiene, something as small as dirty cloths or unwashed hands, could turn a delivery into a death sentence. Of course, germ theory was centuries away, so nobody really understood why mothers spiked fevers after childbirth. Theories ranged from bad air to divine punishment. Naturally, no one considered the midwife's unwashed fingernails as the culprit. Another great danger was obstructed labor. A baby stuck in the wrong position, or simply too large to pass through, spelled disaster. Today, that's when a caesarean section might be performed. But in the Middle Ages, caesarean operations were almost always performed only after the mother was dead, as a way to try and save the baby, or at least baptize it before it too passed away. A live caesarean, where both mother and child survived, was so rare it was practically a miracle story. And so, while noble women might be surrounded by the finest attendants, the dangers were democratic. Death in childbirth did not discriminate much between queens and peasants. In fact, noblewomen might even have been at greater risk, simply because they were expected to produce more children, heirs, spares, and preferably as many as possible. For dynasties, fertility was not just personal, it was political, and that meant queens found themselves perpetually pregnant, perpetually exhausted, and perpetually at risk. We can look at a few examples, because unfortunately there are plenty. Queen Jane Seymour, Henry Roman, VIII's third wife, managed the impressive feat of finally producing a male heir. But she died just days later, likely from complications of childbirth infection. The price of success was her life. Another tragic figure is Eleanor of Castile, who gave birth at least 16 times. She outlived most of her children, and after decades of pregnancies, her body simply gave out. She died at just 49, and if that feels young, that's because it was. Of course, queens and noblewomen were not the only ones affected. Peasant women faced equal or greater risks without the comfort of attendants or the safety of abundant food. Malnutrition played its role too. A poorly nourished body struggles in pregnancy, and many women entered labor already weakened by hard work, disease, or famine. Their bodies were simply not prepared for the strain. It's worth pausing here to notice the cruel irony. Men in power often treated women's fertility as a resource, like land or gold. A noblewoman's worth was measured in heirs produced. But the actual process of producing those heirs was a grim, exhausting, and sometimes deadly experience. And of course, when a queen or noblewoman died in childbirth, men often wasted no time arranging a replacement. The dynasty must continue. Mourning was secondary. Henry Roman ate again, who managed to remarry within just over a year of Jane Seymour's death. Because naturally, personal grief is one thing, but the need for a functioning womb is apparently another. Religious attitudes added another layer. Some clerics painted childbirth as Eve's punishment, a natural suffering for women to endure because of humanity's fall from grace. Not exactly comforting, but it was the prevailing theology. Women themselves might have seen labor as both frightening and spiritually significant. After all, childbirth was not just physical. It had eternal stakes, with the salvation of both mother and child hanging in the balance. And there's a detail here that might keep you awake a little longer. Because of the high risk of maternal death, many women prepared for childbirth as if preparing for death itself. They might make a will before labor, confess their sins, or set their affairs in order. In other words, giving birth wasn't just about welcoming new life. It was also about bracing for one's own possible end. Imagine being 18, 20 years old, about to have your first child, and being told to prepare for death as casually as one might prepare for a long journey. That was the medieval mindset. It also explains why relics and charms were such popular companions in the birth chamber. Pieces of saints' bones, scraps of holy cloth, or even written prayers were brought in to safeguard the delivery. These were not luxuries, but necessities, believed to be as important as any midwife's hands. Without them, a woman might feel spiritually exposed, as if she were entering battle without armor. One can see how fear lingered around childbirth, even in the language. In some regions, women did not deliver a child so much as they suffered a child. The word choice itself reflects the grim reality. And society acknowledged this danger in subtle ways. For instance, women who died in childbirth were sometimes honored as if they had made a form of sacrifice. Their death was framed as noble, even saintly, though one imagines most women would have preferred simply surviving. But perhaps the most striking thing is how normalized this was. Everyone knew mothers died in childbirth. Everyone had seen it happen. Everyone knew children who had lost their mothers before they could even speak. And so, while the birth of a child was cause for celebration, it was always shadowed by tension, anxiety, and the lurking possibility of loss. This constant brush with mortality also shaped family life. Husbands might be left widowed with several young children, forced to remarry quickly out of practical necessity. Children themselves grew up familiar with stepmothers, half-siblings, and blended households. Death and replacement were woven into the structure of family itself. And so we find ourselves back at that dimly lit chamber, the flicker of candles, the murmur of prayers, the anxious waiting outside the door. Birth in the Middle Ages was both hope and hazard, joy and grief, life and death intertwined. A mother and child might emerge safely, or they might not, and in that uncertainty lay the sharpest edge of danger. And so we've drifted slowly through the shadows of the medieval birth chamber. We've wandered among queens and peasants alike, heard the whispers of midwives, the murmurs of priests, and the weary sighs of women who knew the risks far too well. Childbirth in the Middle Ages was never just about new life. It was about survival, about faith, about families balancing between hope and despair. It was about candles burning low, relics clutched tight, and the quiet strength of women who bore the weight of dynasties on their shoulders. And as we leave that world behind tonight, I hope you're feeling a little lighter, a little calmer. History, after all, doesn't only belong to kings and crowns. It lives in the intimate, difficult, and deeply human moments too. So let your eyes close, let your thoughts soften, and let the echoes of the past blur gently into dreams. Thanks for drifting with me tonight. Sleep well, and I'll see you next time.